Hello everyone and welcome to Formscapes. As we have seen throughout the previous episodes of this series, Rupert Sheldrake's theory of morphic resonance seems to be at odds in certain fundamental ways with some of the most basic metaphysical assumptions which frame modern scientific thinking. This framework is often referred to as mechanistic reductionism. In what follows, we will look at how exactly morphic resonance seems to be misaligned with this paradigm. Next, we will look at some philosophies of nature which have attempted to expand beyond the limitations of mechanistic reductionism and examine how morphic resonance might be contextualized by such non-reductionist forms of thought. And then finally, we will look at how morphic resonance might have broader implications for how laws of nature themselves may have came about. The paradigm of mechanistic reductionism, otherwise known simply as reductionism or materialism, consists of a number of very specific assumptions about the nature of the world we inhabit. The origins of this paradigm can be found in the early 17th century with the thought of Galileo and René Descartes, both of whom contributed significantly to a form of thinking which would come to sharply divide the world into two distinct realms. On one side of this bifurcation was the realm of matter, of physical constants, of that which is publicly observable and which can be precisely measured through mathematics. On the other side was the realm of mind, of consciousness, of free will, and of God. The former realm of matter came to be regarded as the realm of objective reality, and thus the proper domain of scientific pursuit. Science was to concern itself with that which was precisely measurable and predictable, while the converse realm of the subjective, qualitative, and unpredictable would instead be the domain of the unscientific, of art, poetry, or theology. The objective world was said to consist of matter, and matter was considered to be that which existed independently of consciousness. Matter was thought to behave in strict accordance with entirely deterministic laws which were set in place by God, and thus matter was considered to be entirely devoid of freedom or subjectivity. Matter was also considered to be entirely reducible. That is to say that material things could, at least in principle, be understood entirely in terms of their parts. The existence of material things was considered to be entirely due to the nature of fundamental laws which acted specifically upon the smallest constituents of the world. The laws of nature, in other words, dictated the behavior of fundamental particles, and if one simply understood the ways in which the laws of nature dictated the behavior of the parts which made up a whole entity, then one would have an exhaustive understanding of the whole entity, as there would be nothing left over in need of being accounted for. The separation of mind and matter would result in very serious conceptual problems which would come to be grappled with by thinkers such as John Locke, David Hume, and, most importantly, Immanuel Kant. Although numerous philosophers and scientists would come to see this bifurcation of nature as incoherent and inadequate for actually understanding the world, the paradigm would nevertheless go on to become ever more entrenched within scientific culture. As science and technology continued to develop throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, many thinkers would increasingly come to transform this mind-matter dualism into a materialistic monism. Such thinkers would contend that the world was, in fact, only matter, and therefore that notions like consciousness, free will, or God would need to be either reduced to matter or would need to be discarded entirely. The clockmaker God and clockwork universe of the Enlightenment would, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, come to be replaced by a clockwork universe with no clockmaker. Human free will would be declared a kind of benign illusion, and consciousness would either be shown to be something which somehow emerges from a substrate of blind, inert, lifeless matter, or else consciousness would prove to be inexorably beyond the scope of scientific naturalism. Both mind-matter dualism and materialist monism both seem to give rise to insurmountable problems, and even to blatantly contradict our empirical experiences of our own existence. Yet these paradigms nevertheless came to not only sustain themselves, but also to achieve a singular dominance within many academic institutions throughout the Western world. By the time of the late 20th century, monist materialism would become so entrenched as an unquestioned presumption of scientific discourse that science popularizers such as Carl Sagan and Richard Dawkins would not even bother to explicitly argue in favor of its principles. The paradigm came to be simply obvious, and thus simply not in need of serious consideration. We can understand this historical development as being the result of the manner in which modern science came to be contextualized by technology. The ultimate measure of science was very often considered to be the extent to which science afforded us forms of control over the natural world. Science, so we have often been told, simply works, and we can be sure that its presumptions are valid because we can clearly see the benefits which science has bestowed upon us in terms of modern medicine, military weapons, electrical power grids, and information technologies. Yet here I am actually arguing for a very different view. That although the basic presumptions of dualism and materialistic monism were rife with both conceptual and empirical problems from their very origins, these paradigms were nevertheless able to rise to dominance specifically because of the manner in which they facilitated the development of modern technologies. Modern technology is that which allows us to systematically predict and control the natural world. In concerning ourselves with such prediction and control, it benefits us to look at the natural world in such a way that we disregard everything which is not predictable and controllable. Both dualism and materialism reduce the objective world to mere matter, which is regarded as inert and lifeless, behaving in accordance with predetermined laws in an entirely mechanistic way. Nature thus becomes sterilized, purged of everything which does not conform to our desire to systematically predict and control. Consciousness and free will thus become either reduced to matter, purged from reality entirely, or quarantined within a realm outside of what is considered to be truly objective. By looking at nature through this lens, however distorting of reality it may be, we allow our attention to focus solely on facts and regularities which allow us to materially alter the world, to extract power and resources from the world, and to reassemble nature into artifacts which serve our material desires. Perhaps unsurprisingly, seeing the world in a strictly mechanistic way is very useful if you are primarily concerned with developing new technologies. Sheldrake's theory of morphic resonance is a theory which grew out from a very different way of conceptualizing nature, and thus we find his theory to be at odds with almost every fundamental presupposition of mechanistic reductionism. Morphic resonance is, as Sheldrake puts it, a theory of formative causation, rather than reductionist or mechanistic causation. As we have already seen, morphic resonance supposes that wholes cannot, in fact or in principle, be exhaustively reduced to their constituent elements. The theory instead presumes that self-organizing systems are able to direct their own structure in a way that cannot be accounted for entirely by the mechanistic behavior of constituent parts. There is immense indeterminacy in such patterns of self-organization, and the notion of formative causation implies that organic wholes, such as living bodies, patterns of behavior, or forms of cognition, can in fact direct their own development by constraining indeterminacies in specific ways. We can see this contrast within arguments pertaining to the nature of free will. It is common for many materialistic scientists and philosophers to argue that free will is a kind of illusion, that your behaviors are all determined by events which are not you, and therefore that you never truly choose to do anything. Your behavior is dictated by events which are happening in your brain, and these events are reducible to the behavior of your neurons, neurotransmitters, and hormones which make up your brain. Your neurons, in this view, do not choose to do anything that they do. Their behavior is mechanically determined by the interactions of proteins, atoms, and electrons. If those parts determine your behavior and the parts themselves do not have free will, then it follows that you do not have free will either. And your sense of freedom would then seem to be a kind of cognitive illusion. And indeterminacy can't seem to provide free will any elbow room either. If our actions are partially dictated by indeterminate quantum dice rolls, we do not therefore become any more free. Saying that a quantum indeterminacy determines your actions does not make you any more free, as the choice is still not your choice. Rather, that which is dictating your behavior is simply indeterminate rather than determinate. Yet, if we conceptualize free will in terms of formative causation, we can see that free will is not a matter of determinacy or indeterminacy, but rather a matter of parts and wholes. That is, a matter of reductionism or wholism. If parts completely determine the behavior of wholes, then there is no room for free will. But if we are able to see that wholes can and do dictate the behavior of their parts, then we can account for free will in an entirely consistent and naturalistic manner. The behavior of individual neurons does not and cannot actually account for the behavior of the whole brain, as the higher level organizational structures coordinate the lower level constituent neurons, which comprise the whole. Perhaps particular structures within the brain and even individual neurons are in fact self-directed by a kind of nested cognitive agency which ultimately coalesces into the highest level totality that is the human being as a whole. Yet Sheldrake also implies that such self-determination of self-organization is not limited to humans, to brains, or even to biological creatures, as it would seem that such phenomena are to be found at all levels of nature. As we explored in the last episode, morphic resonance implies that such formative causation may be at work in the behavior of molecular structures, and even the structure of individual atoms and fundamental particles. This would then potentially imply that at least some degree of agency and subjectivity should be present throughout nature, even down to the most fundamental constituents of the world itself. Viewed through the framework of mechanistic materialism, this would appear to be an absurd claim. Reductionist thinkers are often reluctant to regard human beings as being free in any meaningful sense, and thus the possibility of freedom being somehow inherent to molecules, atoms, and photons would seem to be patently ridiculous. Mechanistic materialism is grounded in the presumption that the fundamental constituents of reality are purely objective, entirely devoid of subjectivity, and thus devoid of freedom. Through other paradigms, however, such a possibility may seem not only plausible, but even to be a necessary conclusion which we arrive at through our understandings of consciousness and reality. The alternative to mechanistic reductionism, which we will be looking at here, is the framework of process philosophy. a systematic mode of understanding nature, consciousness, life, and agency, which attempts to encompass the achievements of scientific naturalism while also affording us means of adequately coming to grips with the aspects of the world which fall outside of the bounds of materialist assumptions. The first such process philosopher we will look at here is the British mathematician and metaphysician Alfred North Whitehead. In his early career, Whitehead concerned himself mostly upon the development of mathematical logic, but throughout the 1910s and 1920s, Whitehead would increasingly come to focus upon philosophy of science and eventually the development of a fundamental metaphysics which would culminate in the publication of Process and Reality, one of the most foundational and influential works within the field of process philosophy. With Process and Reality, Whitehead would develop a rigorous metaphysical framework, which radically diverges from the basic assumptions of mechanistic reductionism. Whitehead believed that such a reimagining of nature had become necessary, as materialistic metaphysics had proven itself unable to account for the radical developments brought forth by the emerging field of particle physics, and unable to account for the reality of subjective experience itself. Whitehead would thus come to conceptualize the world as consisting of events rather than of matter, as we might commonly understand the term. Whitehead would dub these fundamental events or processes as actual entities or occasions of experience, which came to form through a process which he would term concrescence. Concrescence can be understood as the means by which potentialities come to coalesce and concretize within primordial droplets of awareness, which then come to comprise the past and thus the physical aspects of the world which we encounter. In polar contrast with actualities are then potentialities, or what Whitehead would refer to as eternal objects. The basic elements of form, such as mathematical objects, which come together so as to give shape to the world. Eternal objects are patterns regarded in themselves, independently of whatever actualities they might come to give shape to. As the process of concrescence is a process of becoming concrete, eternal objects are that which conditions the definiteness of particular actualities. Whitehead refers to his conceptual scheme as a philosophy of organism, in that the fundamental processes which make up the world are seen to be inherently organic in nature. Thus, the natural world can be seen as being comprised of processes which are inextricably experiential, with each fundamental unit of actuality consisting of both a subjective as well as objective dimension. For Whitehead, then, organism refers not only to biological life forms, but to any beings which are comprised of such organic processes. This would include not only biological cells, but also molecules, atoms, and possibly even higher order structures such as solar systems and galaxies. Whitehead's Process and Reality tells us that the objectivity of the world consists in the manner by which processes come to concretize and thus to become past actualities which are then available to contribute themselves to the continual unfolding of the world. The past thus serves as a ground from which the present is continually able to grow. When we empirically experience the physicality of the world, past actualities which have come to achieve definiteness through their concrescences are contributing themselves into our own processes of experience. Conversely, we then have the subjective dimension of the world, in which fundamental moments of experience actually determine through their own agency the potentialities which give shape to the developing events. Each organic event can be seen as collapsing a space of potentialities into a concretely defined event of the past. Every moment of subjective experience is thus a moment of decision, in which an organic process determines for itself what possibilities come to define its developing actuality. The world is not simply indeterministic in the sense that it is determined by random rolls of quantum dice, but rather because the fundamental processes which constitute the world can only be completed through the activity of living experiences. Seen through process and reality, our world is not simply one of blind, inert mechanism, nor is it merely a kind of insubstantial illusion of consciousness. Rather, it is a world which is fundamentally alive, a world of animacy in which the future is genuinely open, and a world in which cosmic, biological, and human evolutions are revealed to be the creativity of animacy itself. Within Rupert Sheldrake's thought, we see just such animacy and just such organic processes at work. Morphogenetic fields are spaces of potentiality, which organic systems navigate through their development. Animacy is not something which arises as an epiphenomenon from a substrate of inert, vacuous matter, but rather animacy is found within the most basic elements of the world. As these basic elements come to symbiotically converge so as to give rise to more complex wholes, morphic fields likewise organize themselves into nested hierarchies, such that more basic forms of agency and experience come to form the immensely complex structures of cognition and freedom we see within our own human existence. Another monumental thinker within the realm of process philosophy is Henri Bergson, whose thought directly contributed to the development of Sheldrake's own ideas. In examining the correspondences between Sheldrake and Bergson, we will now look at the phenomenon of memory and the roles played by memory within the frameworks developed by these two thinkers. Seen through the lens of reductionist materialism, memory seems as though it should be a fairly straightforward matter, especially given the significant advancements in computational information storage and retrieval which have developed over the course of the past century. We might reasonably assume that the memories of living organisms are essentially similar to computer memories. Information becomes encoded within informational matrices which are presumably found in the structures of the brain, and later on these structures of information can somehow be retrieved or reactivated. Looking at the actual science of memory, however, what we find is a phenomena which is much more nuanced and bizarre. During the early decades of the 20th century, the American psychologist Carl Lashley theorized that memories should be stored within the brain as structures of information which he referred to as engrams, and which he suspected would be located within different regions of the cerebral cortex. In the 1920s, Lashley would conduct experiments upon rats in an effort to actually locate where specific memories are stored within the brain. Lashley would have his rats learn how to run a particular maze, and then would create lesions within the rats' brains in particular areas. Despite substantial efforts, Lashley found himself unable to destroy the memories which the rats had formed, no matter what regions of the cerebral cortex were damaged. His rats were able to retain their memories of how to run the maze regardless. Lashley thus would conclude that memories must somehow be distributed throughout the brain, rather than being stored in particular locations. Although memory science has since developed a better understanding of how certain brain regions play distinct roles in piecing together the information within memories, such as the role of the hippocampus in processing information pertaining to where and when certain memories were formed, we have as yet been unable to actually determine where or how any specific memories are actually stored in the brain. We still cannot say where memories actually are. Another particularly unusual phenomenon is that of memories seemingly being transferred via organ transplants. Although certainly bizarre, this is now a fairly well-documented phenomenon within medical and scientific literature, as is the potentially related phenomenon of personality changes which occur following such organ transplants. Attempts to explain this phenomenon often make reference to the fact that neurons are found throughout various organs of the human body. But it seems unlikely that these bodily neurons could contain complex memories or personality traits given their relatively low density compared with the brain. The human heart, for example, contains some 40,000 neurons, which would not seem to be enough to allow for the formation, retention, and retrieval of specific memories or nuanced personality traits. The human digestive system, by comparison, is estimated to contain between 100 million and 500 million neurons, while we find within the human brain some 86 billion neurons. If memories are indeed distributed throughout the brain, as Lashley seemed to confirm, then why would an organ such as the heart contain a complete copy of such a distributed memory? Storing the memory in more than one location would not seem to provide much benefit to retention and retrieval, even if the relatively minimal number of neurons found within organs such as the heart are sufficient to actually accomplish such tasks. The notion of cellular memory is also sometimes invoked in order to explain these phenomena, but such invocations seem to go far beyond what cellular memory is known to be capable of. Individual somatic cells can indeed retain memories of events which occur at the cellular level, but there is no evidence that an individual somatic cell, or even collections of somatic cells, are able to store complex memories pertaining to the whole organism. The individual cells which make me up have no idea who I am or what sort of specific events I have experienced. Likewise, individual cells within my body are dying and being born constantly, yet I do not have any memories of these events which occur at the cellular level. The memories of my cells, then, are not necessarily my memories, and vice versa. Yet these bizarre phenomena might seem much less strange if we conclude that memories are actually not stored within the brain, or the heart, or the digestive system for that matter. Within his text, Matter and Memory, Henri Bergson develops a manner of thinking about the relationships of mind and matter, or spirit and body, which focuses heavily upon the role of the past and of memory. For Bergson, consciousness itself can be understood as a kind of intensity, which corresponds to the degree to which the past comes to involve itself in the present. When we act only within the confines of the present moment, we act in a way that is more mechanical or habitual. We do not suspend action so as to take into account the past. When we act more consciously, however, we forestall action so as to involve prior thoughts or experiences through what Bergson calls image remembrance. Much like the ontology of event and experience developed by Whitehead, Bergson's ontology of image is one in which consciousness is found to be implicit within the very notions of objectivity and matter themselves. Materialist ontologies typically regard conscious experience as consisting of representations, depictions behind which it is assumed that there resides matter in itself, which is understood to be something entirely independent of consciousness. Instead, Bergson reconceptualizes matter as being itself fundamentally experiential in nature. Bergson's images, much like Whitehead's droplets of experience, are physical or material insofar as they consist of the potential or virtual power to contribute themselves to novel moments of experience. While a representation is implied to be a kind of superficial facade which is exterior to a more fundamental but ultimately unknowable core of purely objective matter, images are for Bergson that which comprises both matter itself as well as the content of our experiences. This reintegration of subjectivity and objectivity, of mind and matter, is central to the projects of both Whitehead and Bergson, and to the project of process philosophy more generally. Bergson's emphasis upon memory and habit, and his discarding of representation, would be of central influence in the development of Rupert Sheldrake's theory of morphic resonance. Sheldrake argues that memory is not a matter of representation stored within synaptic patterns found within the brain, but rather that memory is a fundamental aspect of nature itself, what Sheldrake refers to as the presence of the past. Memories are not stored in the brain, but rather exist within the memory of the world itself, and which are then able to be reinstantiated by the brain, insofar as the brain is able to repeat its past processes through the process of morphic resonance. In order to understand this proposal and its implications, we will use these diagrams of branching pathways in order to illustrate how such a process might play out in more concrete terms. Each of these branching pathways could represent a possible permutation of brain activity, which would thus correspond to experiential states of the organism. At the base of the tree, we might have a very basic pattern of neural activity, perhaps akin to deep sleep or even meditative stillness. As we move up the tree through distinct pathways of the branching diagram, these patterns become more complicated in particular ways, corresponding to more complex and more specific experiential states. On the left, we have a particular pathway followed by the brain over the course of a lived experience or even a thought. The pattern of neural activity develops in a particular way, ultimately achieving a very complex oscillatory state at the top of the tree, which is distinct from a vast array of other possible states. This process of experience is here very much like other processes of organic development, which we have examined previously, such as the self-organization of complex protein molecules, or the embryonic development of an organic body. An immensely complex and specific pattern is achieved from an enormous range of possibilities through a process of self-organization. Now let us imagine how the process of recalling this memory might occur as Sheldrake describes it. In order for the organism to recall a specific memory of an experience, the brain of the organism must attempt to reiterate the pattern of neural activity which it underwent during the initial experience. This recollection could initially be triggered by a similar experience, or simply a thought, or simply the desire to recall a specific memory. In either of these cases, we would see a pattern unfold which closely resembled the unfolding pattern which occurred during the initial experience itself. These first few steps of neural activity would then serve as what Sheldrake would call a morphic germ. For Sheldrake, a morphic germ is a kind of embryonic state upon which morphic resonance can begin to act. The similarity between the morphic germ and similar organic developments which have occurred in the past then allow morphic resonance to guide the further development of the system through automatic averaging. As the first few steps taken are identical or very similar, the process will then be guided by morphic resonance through the pathway of development in such a way that the process comes to repeat the pattern of the initial experience. The memory is not stored and then retrieved, but rather simply exists within the past in such a manner that the brain is able to tune into the previous experience and thus recreate the experience. This process of recollection would be far from perfect, however. If there are multiple memories which are very similar, then it may be that the process of recollection might be pulled by the influence of more than one similar experience. If you take a moment to think about your own memory, I think you will find exactly what Sheldrake's hypothesis would imply. Issues with memory do not seem to involve memories being erased or overwritten. Rather, our difficulties with memory arise when we have numerous experiences which are so similar that we have difficulty determining which details belong to which events. Did you buy a coffee at a coffee shop last Monday on your way to work, or did you get coffee at the gas station? If this is a kind of behavior you engage in very regularly, then chances are you will have a difficult time making such precise determinations, even with events which have happened quite recently. You will find the need to find some sort of distinguishing detail, which can then allow you to relive the specific experience in more detail. Did you buy something you usually don't purchase when you got the coffee? If so, then this detail will then allow you to recreate the experience in a more precise way, as you can begin the process of reiterating the experience from a more distinct starting point. Though it is almost needless to say, memories which are stored within computer systems do not work in this way at all. Computer memories can become corrupted or erased, but we would not expect any of these curious details of the phenomenon of recollection if the brain stored memories in a way which is analogous to computer memory. Understood within the context of morphic resonance, however, these are exactly the kinds of problems we would expect to have with our process of recollection. So, could this conception of memory then also help us to explain how memories or even personality traits might be seemingly transferred through transplanted organs? As previously mentioned, organs such as the heart do contain neurons. Perhaps not enough to contain detailed and specific memories, but perhaps more than enough to contain the embryonic germs of specific memories. The neurons within a transplanted heart might then be able to prompt within the recipient's brain a pattern of complex neural activity associated with a specific experience undergone by the heart's donor. As this initial pattern of activity then becomes directed by the previous experience, the organ recipient then comes to recall the memory in detail, almost as though he or she had experienced the event themselves. The memory itself then needn't be contained within the heart, nor anywhere else within the brain or body. Rather, what is needed is only the capacity for invoking the seeds of the memory, as the memory itself is simply contained in the past. Looking back to Lashley's experiments upon memories within rats, we again see exactly what we would expect. Destroying parts of the rat's brain does not destroy their memories, as the memories themselves simply are not contained within their brains. So as long as the rat's brain can re-instantiate the experience, then the rat will retain access to that memory. At this point, one glaring question remains yet to be addressed. How exactly can the past contain anything? Is some sort of medium required through which the past could come to influence the present through anything other than direct physical interaction? If the past is not simply gone, then where exactly is it? In asking these questions, we find ourselves now within the realms of physics and cosmology. Do we find within those scientific fields any reason to believe that direct physical interaction is the only manner in which causation is able to play out? We do not, and what we find instead within many of these scientific domains is the inexorable conclusion that all physical entities are interconnected throughout both space and time. How then is this the case, and does this interconnectivity also allow for the influence of past events upon events occurring within the present? The Hungarian philosopher of science, cosmologist, and systems theorist Ervin Laszlo has proposed that the quantum vacuum, or zero-point quantum field, must be understood as a field of information integration, which serves as the foundation of the cosmos as we know it. Much like Sheldrake, Laszlo's Akashic field theory indicates that there is an inherent memory within the world itself, one which allows not only for the possibility of organic memory, but which also conditions the existence of the constants of nature in general. Within classical physics, the constants of nature were considered to be laws, in that they were thought to have been created by a god who was thought to be a kind of super intelligent cosmic engineer or mathematician. Today we might say that the laws of physics are akin to the software of the universe, much like the code of a computer simulation. Yet, if we are to understand the universe as evolutionary, rather than as one designed by a divine engineer or programmer, then we must somehow develop a novel understanding of how the laws of physics came to be, and how these laws are able to condition physical events everywhere within our universe. If the code of our universe somehow wrote itself, or rather if nature somehow conditioned its own fundamental constants, then how could that have possibly occurred? Now, I would like to add as a brief aside here that the conception that I am sketching out here is not necessarily an atheistic one either, though it could be said to lend itself more towards a pantheistic or panentheistic view of theology, as opposed to one in which God is considered to be something entirely separate from the universe, imposing laws from elsewhere on the world we inhabit. But putting theology to the side for a moment, Laszlo's conception is much in accordance with Whitehead and Sheldrake in that there really are no fundamental laws of nature which exist independently of cosmic evolution. Rather, the fundamental regularities of nature are more like habits which came about through the self-creative processes of the cosmos. As such processes have unfolded over time, they have also carved out particular developmental pathways, which condition the interactions between the elements of our universe which are most ubiquitous and fundamental: fields, particles, or atoms. As these processes have become ingrained over time through countless iterations, these developmental processes, such as those which allow atoms to form themselves into molecules, have become more refined and consistent. The habituation of these basic processes has crystallized them in such a manner that they can be understood in terms of pristine mathematical models. Many physicists presume that their mathematical models do depict a kind of operating system which conditions the physical universe, though most have no genuine explanation as to why this operating system exists or how it came about. From the perspective of thinkers such as Laszlo and Sheldrake, there is no such operating system. Rather, the information which conditions the present is contained within the past, and it is the quantum vacuum or Akashic field, or perhaps ether, which allows for the formative influence of the past to act upon the continual development of the world. Our universe appears to be fine-tuned because it is, but this tuning is something which the cosmos has achieved through its own development. This is made possible by the fact that the past is not simply gone, but rather stands as a body of achievements which are able to inform the continual creative advance of a living universe. Not only would such a field of formative influence allow for the possibility of phenomena such as morphic resonance, and provide an explanation as to how the laws of physics are able to be universally operative, but it would also allow for an explanation of how physical causation itself is possible. The image which I have sketched out here is undoubtedly a speculative one, but one through which I hope to have illustrated the ways in which morphic resonance theory may have implications which go far beyond developmental biology, and the ways in which the broader framework presented here contrasts with the paradigm of thinking which is most common within academic science. Materialism supposes that the basic rules of the universe amount only to mathematical principles which govern the way in which successive moments come to determine one another. A given instant is determined entirely by the instant that preceded it. Once a moment of time has contributed itself to the next moment within the sequence, it effectively ceases to exist in terms of causal power. It can only influence the future through an unbroken sequence of determinations. A truly evolutionary understanding of nature, in which habits rather than laws come to shape the world, is an understanding which implies that the past does not in fact simply disintegrate into the void, but rather that the past continually contributes itself as a foundation upon which novel developments can be erected. Many are quick to dismiss the theory of morphic resonance and ideas like it, on account of how it seems to conflict with our educated intuitions about how nature operates. But we have abundant reasons, both from established science and theoretical speculation, to see that such intuitions may simply not be able to survive contact with the finer details of the world. Although science has undergone immense transformations over the course of the previous century, much of scientific rhetoric remains crouched in philosophical thinking about science, which came about 400 years ago. The conception of a clockwork, mechanical universe came about in an era within which such machines were the absolute cutting edge of human technological achievement. It may have seemed perfectly reasonable to presume in the 17th or 18th century that biological organisms or even the universe itself might be understood through such mechanical metaphors. Yet even though science itself has advanced considerably beyond what that framework can possibly account for, the mechanistic paradigm continues to shape our assumptions about what seems likely or possible, even while knowing that such assumptions are demonstrably false. And with that, we will be bringing this installment to a close. I mentioned in the last episode that I plan to look into the potential implications of morphic resonance within the realm of parapsychology, but this video's already gotten pretty lengthy. So instead, I will be doing a part 4, which will be dedicated to that subject and also to the potential relationship between morphic resonance and Carl Jung's ideas of archetypes and the collective unconscious. I'm also going to say a bit more about Whitehead's ideas. The kind of non-local influence which is central to morphic resonance is actually something which follows directly from the system which Whitehead develops, and Whitehead himself actually points this out explicitly within Process and Reality. So I'm going to try to illustrate a bit more clearly how I think the ideas of these thinkers map onto one another. As always, thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll be back with another video as soon as I possibly can. Once more, thank you.